At the dawn of the dinosaurs was Coelophysis. Lively and intelligent, it was well on the way to establishing the reign of the dinosaurs. Ironically, no sooner had Coelophysis got a foothold than the species was wiped out by a catastrophe.
To fossilize, an animal must be buried quickly in mud or sand before the bones begin to decompose. Then, minerals seep in and replace the bone, producing a fossil hard as rock. The odds of this happening are so slim they are impossible to calculate.
If you want to bury a dinosaur so it can fossilize, you need one of two things: a lot of mud, like in a swamp so the body sinks, or a sandbar that develops suddenly in a storm and can bury an entire giant carcass in 5, 10, 15, 20, even 30 feet of sand. You need one or the other. Lots of sand, lots of mud.
The man in charge of the whole project is Jack Horner, one of the world's great dinosaur hunters. While the crew digs, he walks the Badlands, trying to piece together the world the T-Rex lived in. This was a floodplain with meandering streams and rivers, which were continually depositing loads of sand and silt. And that's the kind of environment that makes fossils.
If you want to become a fossil, the first thing you have to do is die. This coyote's done his part. He's been here about 4 weeks, and he's getting raunchier by the minute. But to become a perfectly preserved fossil, and to remain that way for 65 million years, this coyote should have died someplace else. Someplace where sand or mud could have covered it over quickly. Then, over millions of years, that sediment would have compacted into rock. And within it, minerals would have entered into the bones of this coyote and turned it into a fossil. But here, that'll never happen. In this arid environment, these bones will be dust in a matter of months.
The fact that they're still together in a system and a flood flow that's able to move bones of this size tells us that these body parts still have flesh as they're getting caught up there. Not only that, though, in this kind of a fast river flow, how long before that flesh rots and these small vertebrae themselves get all torn off from these parts here and get delivered down in this area here? Not long. We're maybe talking a couple weeks, maybe a month, but I really don't think I'd push it that far. So what it's telling us that within that 2-week period roughly, this entire event has to get quickly covered up, because otherwise this stuff will not be held together.
So in a sense, if you come here to the monument and look at the quarry, you're seeing the bones in the exact position they were deposited in a river sandbar 140 million years ago.
140 million years.
During the Jurassic period, the oceans were more widespread than at any other time on Earth. The land masses shifted and sea levels rose, flooding large areas. Houston, New Orleans, Miami, even the Midwest were waters hundreds of meters deep. The ocean extended all the way into central Utah. It was in that world that the first big killer could be found.
It was my first visit to the far west, Marsh wrote, and all was new and strange, reminding me of mid-ocean with its long rolling waves, brought suddenly to rest. It was, in fact, the bottom of an ancient sea. A Marsh lieutenant wrote of finding dinosaur remains mingled together in the most inextricable confusion and in every conceivable position, as though in some ancient mud holes these huge monsters had become mired and died.
Bone beds containing herds of plant-eating dinosaurs are common.
This is the richest dinosaur graveyard in the world, Drumheller. Almost 500 skeletons of 50 different species have come from these cliffs.
In 1978, his team discovered a vast bone bed of 500 centrosaurs, apparently struck down in the prime of life.
These bone beds are telling us that a number of animals are dying together, and that these killing events are wiping out large numbers of animals across that coastal plain. these animals must have been struggling in the mud. There had to be some kind of movement that churned the mud up.
Fossilized dinosaur bones are often found in sediment created by rain or flood. And there was water everywhere.
The great creature had died in the water.
Because the lagoon in which the feather and skeleton were preserved is unique, the remains of Archaeopteryx and other creatures are perfect in every detail.
The animal died in a stream bed, and the lower jaw had separated from the skull up there.
And it's clear that they were probably crossing a swollen river and got drowned trying to cross.
Well, the explanation we had for this bone bed is that a herd of centrosaurs tried to cross a river in flood, and that a lot of these animals drowned.
It's most likely that these animals died trying to cross the river in flood.
We looked for fossils in sedimentary rocks, rocks that were laid down by rivers and streams when these animals actually lived.
Or perhaps it was just something as simple as a flood.
First of all, it was buried in a flooding event, but it was almost certainly ripped up by those flood waters as well.
Sometimes bone beds accumulate from large areas of the land where floods have brought all kinds of animal remains together and mixed them up.
Floodwaters spreading across the plains could have washed together the remains of several unrelated tyrannosaurs.
It appears that the animals were the victims of a huge flood. Extremely powerful currents piled their multi-ton bodies stack, and the river sediment buried their bones.
The dinosaur had to be buried, very, very rapidly.
Yes, but how?
It was buried very rapidly in a flash flood.
The entire floodplain was probably scattered with these rivers, with ponds and lakes and large meadows.
In the sea, minerals which are dissolved in solution, they move around in groundwaters which surrounded our body originally.
Leo's body had been submerged underwater, then covered by silt.
So what we think was going on here is that this entire area was flooded out 75 million years ago during a hurricane or an intense tropical storm.
And with the floodwaters rising, Leo was doomed.
Regardless of how Leonardo died, or how he ended up in the water, the fact remains that that carcass had to have been buried very, very rapidly.
As the storm abated, the floodwaters receded, leaving behind widespread carnage.
During a violent storm that carried the bone in a flash flood down the river and washed me up on the beach. Now with time, as the water receded and waned, the sand would just deposit right on top of me and bury me.
This entire area was covered by a tropical sea. You can find the remains of some of the mammals who came after the seas receded.
Leonardo's life was lived along the shores of the Western Interior Seaway. As the climate warmed, the inland sea receded. Could a single catastrophic event have been responsible for their deaths?
Flood.
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 Flooding event.
Floods.
Floodwaters.
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 Flooded in a flash flood.
Floodplain.
In a flash flood.
It appears that the animals were the victims of a huge flood.
But it was almost certainly ripped up by those floodwaters as well.
Floodwaters spreading across the plain.
Unlike bones, dinosaur tracks are frozen moments of history. A dinosaur seemed to hesitate as it walked slowly across a slippery mudflat in prehistoric Arkansas.
And these footprints are not arranged just randomly, they're arranged in groups, which really show that they're all going in the same direction.
And in some places you can follow them for long stretches, long distances, hundreds and thousands of meters, and you can see that they all move, sometimes they all turn, and it really seems to suggest that they're all moving together. It's not just a coincidence that they're all in the same direction.
What we have right all around us here are a series of
brontosaur trackways going parallel. These 5 animals were going in this direction as a group.
There was a mudflat here around the margin of a freshwater lake. The lake filled and eventually sediments covered the whole area, and the mudflats turned into mudstones. In them are preserved huge footprints. No other had such a huge foot. Here the animal has trodden on a small shell, a kind of freshwater mussel. Mollusks virtually identical to this still live today, so these little shells confirm that these dinosaurs that day were splashing through the shallows.